Hello, welcome to Teach United's webinar on maximizing federal funding for small and rural schools. Today's webinar is being recorded. My name is Marcia McCaffrey, Senior Director of U.S. Partnerships at Teach United. I joined Teach United this winter after 23 years at the New Hampshire State Department of Education, where one of my duties was serving as the Rural Education Achievement Program State Coordinator. So I have a deep appreciation of the work it takes to get to an approved grant application and navigate the funding to secure the best outcomes for your schools. Everyone wants to spend their money wisely. What everyone may not know are the federal program options that give small and rural schools flexibility for designating how these funds can be spent. This webinar identifies such options and provides some context and examples for each option. Because once you know your options, you can think strategically about how to maximize your federal funding to meet particular school and district needs. After the presentation, we will send everyone a PDF of the slides. We've also embedded QR codes in the slide deck, which will link to the document cited in the presentation. So please watch for an email from Teach United with a link to these resources, and feel free to share that with others. During the webinar, you will have the ability to send chats and questions to our TU hosts through the chat box. If we don't get to all the questions live, we'll be sure to follow up as needed. As this presentation references statutory regulations, here's a fair warning. It is text heavy. While it isn't a training session, the webinar is grounded in federal guidance, which automatically results in lots of words and lots of acronyms. Let's start with navigating the system. This slide is a bit of a disclaimer. This is a national webinar, and wherever you are, your state is going to have its own processes, timelines, and expectations for navigating federal funds. When in doubt, check with your state agency or federal REAP program director. Both are found on the USED REAP website. The QR code link provides you that website. And it's important to underscore that all federal title program funds must be used to supplement, not supplant, any federal, state, or local education funds. I'd also like to point out a quick tip about the slides for the webinar. You can navigate where we are in the slideshow by looking at the icons in the top left-hand corner and then the tabs in the top right-hand corner. Those tabs are grayed out now, but you can see that we're ready to move on to procurement. So let's just say it. Title programs are allocated to districts and are meant to be spent, and spent wisely on products, services, supplies, technology, hardware, software, and so forth. This slide sets a baseline for making purchases because ultimately that's what you're going to be doing. As a baseline, each LEA is to have their own procurement policy. Just a couple of reminders here about aligning local policies to federal procurement requirements, and that your local policy should lay out the processes for making purchases and contracting with vendors. Maybe your policy is up to date. Maybe it needs to be refreshed. Whatever the circumstance, don't think you need to start from scratch. Find out who's got a model policy. That might be another small LEA, a service organization, even a large LEA that can afford dedicated staff to do this sort of work. Check around and find a model policy that you can work from. Speaking of money, I would expect that most, if not all, of your acquisitions fall within the simplified acquisition threshold. The good thing about making purchases that fall into the micro purchase and small purchase categories is that the process is streamlined. There's no requirement for sealed bids or competitive proposals. This saves a whole lot of time and a whole lot of effort. A brief word now about non-competitive proposals or sole source. Sole source isn't limited to purchases over $250,000. It's possible to request your state to authorize a sole source purchase for under that amount, which may be the easiest way to make a small purchase. You'll need to provide a rationale, but do check with your state for specific guidelines. Remember, once you know and understand the federal and your state's procurement requirements, you'll be able to maximize your federal funds and expedite your purchases. Now let's look at strategic money management. Here's the big question. What has the highest return on investment that meets the greatest need with the most impact for improving student outcomes? While it's easy to purchase stuff your schools need, making a plan and thinking strategically will maximize your funds. You want to focus on high priority needs that produce sustainable, equitable results. And with ESSER 3 funds winding down this year, it's a good time to ask yourself, what can I do now to spend down these ESSER funds that will have lasting impact in the years ahead? To help you arrive at your needs and priorities, go to your guiding documents, including your own district strategic plan or educational improvement plan. Does your state require a professional development plan? If so, how might that plan frame your thinking for priority spending? What about recommendations from an accreditation report or your district's ESSER use of funds plan? You can also look at your state's Every Student Succeeds Act plan as a way to identify priorities. Another way to identify priorities and needs is to look at the data. Obviously, assessment data can be used to identify and justify any needs associated with improving student performance in literacy, mathematics, and science. Do you collect parent, community, or stakeholder data through surveys? What about teacher surveys indicating their self-identified needs and priorities? Do you collect other non-academic data that you can draw from and reference in your request for federal funds? Is there data from business groups you should be looking at to show post-secondary needs and what schools should be providing to students to succeed in the workforce or in college? And finally, look at your own resources. What resources do you have that are just needed outright? What resources do you have that need to be updated? And then which ones are simply underutilized? And by resources, I mean anything that the school uses or needs to improve learning opportunities for students. It's not just books and materials, computers and software, but teachers and staff are a key resource in the school. Let's take a quick look at ESSER 3 funds. Undoubtedly, the largest outlay of federal funding for local school districts ever, and time is running out for allocating and dispersing these funds. Again, the same big question. What can you do now that has the highest impact and highest return on investment that meets the greatest need with the most impact for improving student outcomes? Do you have any money left in your ESSER 3 account? And if so, now is the time to think about making adjustments to your overall plan so you are able to reinforce what's been working or pivot to something new that makes better sense based on your review of data, your observations, or the changing needs of your school and community. Remember, ESSER 3 funds must be obligated by September 30, 2024. Use your state's upcoming window of opportunity to submit grant requests for the upcoming year. Now's the time to invest in human capital, your boots on the ground, your teachers, administrators, and your staff overall. It's also time to support programs for students, programs that will have lasting impact and support overall learning outcomes and opportunities. Now we're going to take a look at a sample activity that pulls together required components of a funding request. This example could be used for ESSER funding, for Title IIA, for SRSA, or even RLIS. Our strategic plan prioritizes students with a personalized learning experience. However, through classroom observation, we have learned that our early career educators are not embedding personalized learning opportunities into their practice. Therefore, our early career teachers need training and coaching in personalized learning strategies. The impact of training will be evidenced through teacher feedback sessions and evaluating lesson plans, along with witnessing change of practice during formal observations and walkthroughs. As a result of this experience, teachers will be better prepared to implement personalized learning experiences and able to support other teachers in the school. As you can see, this example pulls from all of the things we reviewed in previous slides and consolidated them into a concise, clear plan for spending. This sample activity identifies the source of the priority, the strategic plan, the data source that identifies the need, classroom observation, who the target audience is for the activity, that's early career educators, what the need is, training for the early career educators for personalized learning, and what data will be collected to measure the impact of the training. The last sentence captures the desired outcome as a result of the training. Hopefully, this example resonates with the expectations your state has for describing grant activities. If you're here as a small school or a rural school district, there's a high likelihood that your district is a recipient of the Rural Education Achievement Program. On the screen is the opening paragraph to the USED REAP informational document. The emphasis here is on the flexibility provided by the program to provide better educational services to students in eligible schools and districts. I'll pause just a moment for you to capture the QR codes, and please know this will be coming to you in an email as a PDF, so you can grab those codes off that PDF too. I'm making an assumption that if you receive REAP funds, you know the basics of the program. If you're not sure about the program, start with the resources shown with the QR codes on the prior slide. I tend to use the REAP informational document as my go-to resource. The USED did a good job explaining these two programs in relation to the legislation in this resource. REAP has two subparts: rural low-income schools, that's RLIS, and small and rural school achievement, that's SRSA. RLIS is managed at the state level. SRSA is managed at the federal level. Comparing the two programs, you can see that SRSA and RLIS are very similar in terms of applicability of funds to title programs, with the exception of Title IV-B applying only to SRSA and parental engagement being called out in RLIS. However, this call out does not exclude parental engagement activities from SRSA, as Title I-A allows for funds to be spent in that category too. So in brief, REAP funds are considered to be highly flexible because these funds allow for activities that align with the authority of each of these federal title programs. That's Title 1A, Title 2A, Title 3, Title 4A, and as pointed out, Title 5B for SRSA and parental engagement for RLIS. That's a mouthful. Whew. Now, let's dive into some of the unique flexibility options provided through REAP. I have only one slide on flexibility for RLIS, and it's this one on joint application. Otherwise, the flexibility for RLIS lies with the ability to apply funds to the authority of the other title programs. This slide shows the full extent to what the USED has published in their guidelines on joint application. What we know is that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, currently known as ESSA, permits 2 or more eligible LEAs, a consortium of LEAs, or an educational service agency to apply for 1 or more programs covered by the state's Consolidated State Plan. That is, if each eligible LEA elects to participate in the joint application or chooses to allow the ESA, the Educational Service Agency, to apply on its behalf. If this piques your interest, I direct you to your state REAP coordinator or USED program director to learn more about submitting a joint application. The scenario presented is one possibility. That is, I read the answer as the answer written by the USED could apply, but approval would be up to your state. Joint application has the potential for some powerful flexibility, but details need to be understood. Now let's talk about an option specific to SRSA, the Alternative Fund Use Authority, or everyone's favorite acronym to pronounce out loud, AFWA. So here's the skinny on AFWA. If you're eligible to receive SRSA funds, then you can exercise AFWA without approval from either your state agency or the Federal Department of Education. All you need to do is notify your state agency of your intent to exercise AFWA by the date established by your SEA. Looking at some specifics about AFWA, it's important to know that AFWA is not the same as transferability, but that it actually provides more flexibility than that of transferring funds from Title 2A and Title 4A programs as authorized. I'll do a little bit more about transferability after the AFWA slide. So if you have questions, just hang in there a little bit. But transferability would be a whole webinar on its own almost. This section reads a lot like transferability, but since AFWA provides more flexibility than the standard option of transferability, it does beg the question, so what is that? The more flexibility question is answered here, whereas the funds which the district designates as AFWA are not subject to all the rules and requirements of the other title programs included when AFWA is used. So what's that mean? Well, the only one and clear example of this from USED is that the funds would not be subject to the Title 4A requirement of proportioning funds into the 3 buckets of that title program. That is, if your Title IV allocation is at or above 30,000, and most small and rural schools don't have that amount in their Title 4A funding, but you never know. These 3 buckets are well-rounded education, safe and healthy students, and effective use of technology. So again, if your district receives 30,000 or more in Title 4A, this could be very beneficial, this one option within AFWA. But there's more. And here's a big part. This rule applies to any local education agency eligible for SRSA, whether you receive funding or not. That is, you could be SRSA, but zero funded. So you're still eligible for AFWA. And whether or not you were dual eligible and selected RLIS as your program of choice. One big thing to keep in mind is that you must notify your state agency if you choose to exercise AFWA. Since AFWA is not the same as transferability, you can learn more about transferability in the USED REAP informational document referencing page 43. The transferability provision applies to all districts, large or small, not just REAP recipients. And transferability applies most particularly to Title IIA and Title 4A funds most directly. I'll finish up with this last slide on AFWA and transferability, providing a couple of examples of each, with AFWA examples from the U.S. Department of Ed guidance on the left, and an example of transferability that I wrote on the right. To be clear, transferability applies to all school districts because all districts receive Title A and 4A allocations, and transferability applies most directly to these two title programs. For example, if an LEA sees a need for a professional development program that exceeds their Title II allocation, Title 4A funds may be transferred to Title IIA, which increases the allocation, allowing the district to participate in the professional development program that meets their need. So that's one example of how transferability allows for maximizing your federal funds. Here's a rundown of the big ideas pulled together in this presentation. Make strategic decisions for impact, sustainability, and capacity building. Articulate what success looks like and how the impact of the activity will be measured. The simplified acquisition threshold equals a faster and easier procurement process. Take advantage of the broad authority of ESSER 3. Funds can be used for all the title programs and even be used for general operating expenses. Very unusual. But here's the warning: funding cliff ahead. That's why it is important to think strategically about all your funds. There's a lot of money on the table for next year, including the current federal fiscal year 2023. If you have any unobligated title funds, those are still on the table, plus the new federal fiscal year 2024 title funds coming in July, plus remaining ESSER funds that you may have. So that's a lot of money and a lot of purchasing. Finally, think to the future. Map out needs and priorities over the next 3 to 5 years. Plan programmatically and financially over that 27-month title cycle, 27 months for those title program funds. You can always pivot in another direction if needed, but plan out over time so you don't leave money on the table and the funds are wisely used. This goes a long way to ensuring a strong return on investment, which equals a happy school board and a happy community. And in the end, we're always striving for better results for students. I thank you for your time and attention. And if any of our Teach United programs align with your needs, I'd love to set up a time to chat so you can learn more about what we do. Our focus is on rural and small schools designed to empower educators and administrators with the tools and materials they need for improving learning conditions for all students. Our goal is to build internal capacity for sustainable change. We have programs for administrators, teachers, and we have a new program especially designed for early career educators. All our programs also include training and coaching. Here's my contact information. Again, my name is Marcia McCaffrey, and please email with any questions you may have. The QR code will take you to a dedicated page for this webinar where the recording and the presentation materials will be uploaded a little later today. It looks like we do have a couple of minutes for questions. So let me go to the chat and see if anything has come in. So here's a question. If SRSA is managed at the federal level, why do I have to notify the state of my intent to use AFWA? That's a good question, because it seems like, well, if they don't have anything to do with it, why do I have to notify them? So I can think of two reasons for this requirement. The first one is that the state REAP coordinator, who you probably would be contacting or would get the form that you filled out, your state REAP coordinator will need to notify the other title folks that review applications in their title programs, because your application to those other programs might look distinctly different, and it would raise some concern and very likely not be approved unless that person knew that they were looking at an application that requested AFWA. And the second reason I can think of is that each year the US Department of Ed asks states to report on how many districts requested AFWA. So if the state they need that information so they can report back to the US Department of Ed. There are all these systems that work within systems when we're talking about federal funding. So even though something doesn't seem like it makes sense, there's probably some other reason back there at the state level, the federal level, some requirement within ESEA that makes that happen. So that was a really good question. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a great day, and be sure and send any questions you have that may come up later. You can send them to me in an email, and do share the resources we send to you as appropriate to the folks you know that might have a use for this information as well. Thank you so much.